So now if we want to export our tree to Maya, you first have to make sure that in your oak shaders and leaf shader and ivy shader, you have enough cutout meshes to take advantage of the full extent of the Megascan atlas. Then we can go to export. So let's make file export. And this time we're going to export it as a FBX because it's easier like that to reach the blend attributes for blending our leaves, our branch, sorry, in Maya. So let's export everything. So export mesh. This time we're gonna choose a FBX. So let's go to SpeedTree Alt Export Tutorial. So let's take this one and call it tutorial 3 FBX. And we're going to have more or less the same options that we had for the Alembic export. So we are going to split again by material. So we have separate object. This time we don't want to have the leaf reference because we want to have the leaf as meshes. We do include the vertex blend. If you want to have the vertex blend mesh separated, you can choose it here and choose separate, or exclude if you want to not export them at all. Okay, so we won't export the texture neither because we have them already stored in our bank. So let's just say OK, and it's going to export our tree as an FBX. And now let's go back to Maya and let's start to prepare a scene for our rendering. So let's create a plane. Okay, and we'll wait to see the size of our tree to decide actually how big to do it. So it's still exporting. So let's create, as we did in Houdini, a light. We're going to create a dome light. I'm working with Redshift in Maya as well. So let's go in our bank asset, set a texture, HDRI, and I'm going to use the same vintage measuring lab to have my neutral lighting. Let's see if SpeedTree. So you see the geometry is pretty big, so it takes quite a while to export. I haven't speed up the video yet here, so we are actually exporting that in real time. Let's wait a little bit more and let's go and see if my scene in Maya is well set. So let's go in the render attribute, and we want to render with Redshift. In the advanced tab, let's check that the global animation is well set. It's okay. And as for the sampling, let's take this to manual sampling. Okay, let's see if SpeedTree finished to export. Now it's still exporting. So you see the leaves are much heavier that way than with the reference leaves because the reference leaf is just exporting point cloud with orient, but here is exporting like many points per leaf. I mean, as much points as you've put on the mesh cutouts. So it might take a while. So I'll cut the video and come back in Maya when the export is finished. Okay, it took 1 or 2 minutes more to export. Let's close that and let's go back to Maya and let's import our tree. So let's go to the tree to export and let's click and drag the tutorial tree FBX into our scene. Let's keep the default settings for the FBX. We don't need to change anything to import a tree. Might take a while to import as well because the poly count is pretty high. So actually I was wrong. I might have choose the proper orientation for our tree as the importer for the FBX. It's not a big deal. I can just rotate it by pressing J on the keyboard and snap it to the proper angle. So here you see I have a tutorial tree containing different shapes. So everything is polygons for now. And these are going to be supporting our transparency opacity to get the proper profile for the leaves. Okay, so let's hide the leaves. And actually, these are all under one shape. It's a bit bothering me. I'm going to press Shift P to put them outside, and so they are not all in the same shapes, the same transform for the shapes. So let's delete this one. Let's put them in a group, and let's call it tree A. And for now, let's just keep the bark. as we did in the version for Houdini. Let's observe the UV. So let's go in the UV editor and let's hide the UV toolkit. It's gonna be a bit slow because again, Maya doesn't like to display huge amount of UV too much. So you wouldn't want to edit the UVs here. It's far too big. So as in Houdini, you see we have these geometries for the transitions that are actually laying on the UVs of the main branch, and it's gonna make a soft transition to the children. And in Maya here we have now, because we export it as an FBX, in the UV set we have a second blend AO UV set, and this one is just these meshes here are laid that way horizontally, so we can just take this UV set and map a ramp on it to actually make the transition for the opacity. So let's close that, and let's apply them a new material. So let's go in the Redshift tab, let's take a Redshift material, let's open the Hypershade. And sorry for the font size, I'm on a 4K screen and the interface is behaving a bit funky. So let's frame our shader, the shader we've actually just generated. Let's rename it Bark Shader. Oops, not that. And oh yeah, because there's already an object called Bark Shader in the scene, so it renames it like that. Let's call it Bark SHD. So let's take our texture. So let's create a file texture. I'm gonna press here. It's gonna open the source image, but I want to go in the bank. Asset, modules, 3A. You can see it, yeah. Textures, 3Bark. And let's take the albedo. And first, maybe we can just map the ramp on the transparency so that you can see how we actually connect a texture to a UV set in Maya. So let's take a ramp texture. And so if you're not using Redshift, you might use a different technique than for Redshift. So in Redshift, you can just type here the UV set you want the texture to be mapped on. So if you go back and check the name of the UV set here, let's go in the UV editor, or we can just open the UV set editor. It's going to be cheaper to open than the. So it's the blend AO UV set. So if we say that this one is actually on the blend underscore AO, and we plug this one in the color, we can check the behavior of that. So let's open the Redshift render view, and let's run an IPR. Okay, so now let's take a look at our ramps. If I contrast my ramp, I should be able to see. So maybe it's not a V ramp, it's a U ramp, because the actual parameters is mapped horizontally. So I shouldn't take here a V ramp, but change it to a U ramp. And now I see the attribute of my ramp actually mapped on these objects. And the other ones, they are all on the right side of the UVs, so they are fully white. So it's actually this attribute that I'm going to be able to use to map my transparency. So here, if you see that here I'm using the UV set blend AO. If I wasn't, the ramp would be mapped on the default first UV, and it wouldn't be mapped properly. So let's restart, and you see that now if I just use the base UVs, it's not going to be a good fit for this attribute. So let's go back to the blend AO. If you want to do that and that you're not in Redshift, so maybe in Arnold or other rendering engine, you might not have access to this tab here. So what you can do is to click on your object, and you go to Windows, Relationship Editor, UV Linking, Texture Centric. Yeah, so you can actually choose the texture and plug it to a UV set. So you can force it not to be on the default UV set. It's much slower to display this window when you have a very complex mesh. So I really do prefer the technique of using this UV set override right in the Redshift tab. So okay, let's just then construct the rest of our shader. So we want to have our file here as the albedo. Okay, yeah. So this one is sRGB. Let's duplicate and let's create a new file. Texture. This is gonna be our roughness. And let's go grab the roughness. This one is going to be raw. Let's take the normal. Let's take the normal, and the normal is going to be raw as well. So the normal is going to be into a bump. So it's redshift bump map. Let's plug it in the input. It's going to be a turn on space normal with an intensity of 1. This one is going to go into the bump input. Okay, let's give us a little bit of space. This one is going to be, so that we can take the alt color R, and we can plug that in the reflection roughness. And this one is going to be the albedo. So let the alt color go into the diffuse color. And now we just want to map the opacity to this ramp. So here we have the opacity color. So let's just take the alt color and put that as opacity color. So you remember it was black on the top of the, on the end of the blend geometry, and it was white at the base. So it's going to be opaque at the base, transparent at the extreme alt part of the mesh, and it's going to reveal progressively the texture from Mini. So let's test that. So let's start the IPR again. And actually, we're getting a half transparent texture. And just to show you why, I'm gonna disconnect this from the opacity and the albedo as well, and plug this back into the diffuse color. And actually, so let's also put the opacity back to 1. You see that actually I'm not completely white on the trunk of the body of the trunk, because actually if I let's turn that into like much more noticeable color, like this one is going to be blue and the other side is going to be red. So you see that the rest of the trunk is actually picking the default color of the ramp. So if I go here and change the default color, let me bring back here. Actually, here I could make another color, and then we will have the full opacity for the rest of the trunk. I guess they are either out of the range of the UVs, or they don't have the UVs in this UV space, so they just use the default color. So let's close that. For the default color, we'll put white. This one is going to be black, as it's the end of the gradient, and this one is going to be white. Now we should be fine with the opacity if we plug this back in the shader. So let's plug this one back in the opacity color, and let's take our albedo back in the color. And now we should be good with our transition, and we can, if we want, remap the gradient of the transition here. So if we want to put if we want to make the transition to go further, we can just store this picture and compare with and without. And you can see that now I can have my transition going further or less. So actually what it does is that we have the mesh here making a gradient from 0 to 1. And the UVs of this transition geometry actually has the UVs, the same UVs than the parents. So it makes a transition from the parents UV to the branch and actual branch. So it makes a soft transition between the two, which is actually pretty clever, a pretty clever technique. So we are okay for the shaders of the branch, and now we can create the shaders for the leaves. So the shader for the leaves, let's display our oak leaves again. And now we're gonna make a new shader. And for the leaves, if you follow the Houdini part, we need to have a sprite shader. So the sprite is gonna actually allow us to crop the shader by an opacity map, and it's going to be much more efficient than mapping the transparency in the opacity of the shader, because the opacity in the shader can be half transparent, and it's much heavier to sample an half transparent object, even though the map is black and white, than actually crop it with a black or white instead of having some level of gray in between. So we need to choose the shader for this, so we can make a material. So let's take a rich material. Let's delete the shading group, plug it into the shader tab. We want to choose a map for the cropping. So let's go in a bank, asset, modules, leaf oak, and go into textures and pick the opacity. It's gonna be automatic for the settings of the color space. So it's gonna be linear. And let's call our texture for the leaf. So let's take the file. So we are gonna need many file texture. Let's create a few of them. So one for the albedo, one for the roughness, one for the normal, and we can take one for the translucency eventually. Okay. When I duplicate the node, they don't get their connection, so I'm just recreating the file each time. So let's go and take the texture for the oak leaf. Textures up. Let's take the albedo. Let's take the normal. Let's take the roughness, and let's take the translucency. And translucency is going to be sRGB. It's okay. Roughness has to be raw. Normal has to be raw as well. We need to make a bump map shader. Texture is going to be here. Sorry, is it the normal here or is it the roughness? Yeah, it's normal. It's okay. So we want this to be a tangent space normal with the amount of 1. The output is going to be going to the bump input. The roughness here, we're going to take the R output and put it in the reflection roughness. The albedo here is going to go in the diffuse color, and the translucency here is going to go in the translucency color. And we can increase the weight of the translucency. This you have to test with some renders to decide which is the proper amount for it. So with this setup, we should be good to make a first render with the leaves. So let's go back and start the render view. Let's remove this render region and start the render. So it's gonna pre-process the texture for the leaf as well, and start the render once he put all this bunch of texture in the VRAM. Okay, so now we have the shader for our leaves. So we don't have this nice repartition we made in Houdini with the setup for the leaves, but you will have all the variations that you've choose in Speed 3. So that's basically it for the connection of the shader in Maya. So you can do the same thing for the ivy leaves, and then you can start to play with your shaders and make some more procedural shaders if you want on the bark to add some maybe some moss on the top using maybe a snow shader, and just to use it as a mask in a blend material to add some triplanar projected moss on the faces pointing upward, for example. So you can start to make some procedural shaders to enhance the look of your bark procedurally. So that's how you plug your texture back from Speed 3 in Maya Redshift.